The television is probably one of the most used pieces of technology on the planet, right up there with your smartphone and computer. But we almost never think about what it took to get here, the technology behind it and the struggles and the people behind the screen. This is a story of Philo Farnsworth, one of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century that you probably never heard of. A self-taught farm boy who sketched the idea for the electronic television when he was just 14 years old. He fought to be credited for what he had built. He eventually won the legal battle but lost the larger war for recognition and reward. And in his final years, he went chasing something even bigger than television, bottling a star. He built a nuclear fusion device using an innovative containment method, one that actually seemed to work. But even as he built it, he privately wondered if humanity had any right to wield it. In today's episode, Emmy-nominated editor and biographer Paul Schatzkin returns to tell the story of this unknown genius. Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. Hope you guys are doing well. We have a returning guest today. He's somebody who's I've done a podcast with in the past, almost 2 or 3 years ago, and it was on the topic, very famous video on the topic of Thomas Townsend Brown, one of the obscure scientists of the 20th century who worked on electrogravitics and gravitational devices. So today's podcast with Paul is based on his biography of the boy who invented television, as the book is titled, Philo Farnsworth. Paul, thank you so much for coming back. It's been a while. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you again. I'm looking forward to this conversation because this is a topic that's very close to my heart.
Before this, I was doing a little bit of research, and correct me if I'm wrong, I was surprised to find out, pleasantly surprised, that you were actually an Emmy Award nominated editor.
Yeah, I worked in the television industry in Los Angeles between about 1975 and 1980. And during that time, I worked on a situation comedy called Barney Miller, which had a very unique approach to the way the videotape that was recorded was edited, and I was part of that team. And we were nominated for an Emmy Award in 1978. That was also the year that PBS broadcast a program called The Addams Chronicles, which was the life of the John Addams family, and that was the show that won that year. But we were nominated, and I have that award hanging on my wall, or that nomination, actually. Yeah.
That was really cool. I wasn't aware of
this. At some point, I hope we'll get a chance to talk about Emmy Awards because it is an essential part of the story that we're here to tell today.
Yeah, I hope we talk about it because that's really fascinating. Yeah. And I didn't know about it right until 10 minutes ago because I was going through some of the work that you did and everything. And I'm like, there it says Emmy Award nominee. I mean, I'm like, wow, I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yeah. Well, I worked in the television industry during that period in 75 to 80. That was the period during which I learned of the story that we're going to talk about today. And I originally latched onto this story thinking that I could use it to launch my career as some kind of television producer. But I was unable to generate the interest that I felt the story that deserved. So after several years of trying, I went sailing in Hawaii for the next decade.
Oh, that's a cool story.
Shirt I was working with.
We could probably talk about that another time.
Sure. Yeah.
So the point I wanted to start with is, at least here in India, for example, as a kid, I remember, in school, they used to ask who invented the television, and we had a nice, short, packaged answer that we regurgitated was John Logie Baird, the Scottish person. And he is, of course, credited as one of the inventors of the mechanical television, not the electronic television.
Right.
And I'm not sure if there was a similar packaged easy answer that kids learned back then. I guess it was the RCA and the corporates and the companies, right?
Yeah. There's a whole range, actually, of what I call the false narratives around the origins of video, the video component of television, which is sound and picture. And it was only known as television in the earlier years, and we didn't begin to use the term video until much later when it became, a pocket-sized technology. But so we'll use television as the original terminology. but there's at least the mechanical thread that you identified, which is the John Logie Baird story, and then there's the monolithic corporate capital thread, which is the RCA story. They are both false narratives, at least from my perspective, because to start with the John Logie Baird story, it was clear that some kind of television would evolve from the technology that we already had in, say, the early to mid 1920s, because by then we had radio and we had motion pictures. And it seemed a logical extension that at some point motion pictures would merge with radio and we would have moving pictures that fly through the air. But it's illustrative of the thinking of the time that the earliest attempts to do that were actually extensions of motion picture technology using mechanical apparatus. So in the case of John Logie Baird, what you have is a flat spinning disc. Well, I'll back up a second and say the challenge of broadcasting any kind of moving image, unlike a film image, which is one full frame at a time, is that in order to transmit that image electrically, you need to break it down into its component parts. You have to scan it essentially,
Right.
and that was the challenge that that faced people trying to do television. So the earliest attempts were drawing on the known technology of the day, which involved, in this case, a flat spinning disc that had a spiral of perforations in it. And as each hole went past the image, a different line of light would be transmitted onto a photoelectric cell. So you have a subject, you have light reflected off the subject going through this mechanically spun spiral of holes to reach an electric cell and photoelectric cell and produce an electric current. The problem with that approach was it would never get anywhere close to the kinds of velocities required to transmit a coherent image. And I can show you, or you can even find on YouTube, examples of how far that technology got, in particular with a man named John Logie Baird, who in London in 1926 got as far as that technology was ever going to go. And he did, in fact, transmit some semblance of a moving image, even as far as across the Atlantic, and I think in 1928. And so that's why we run into John Logie Baird's name, because he was the first to be able to do that, but he did it with a technology that was obsolete the moment it was demonstrated. Or I will say, but more precisely, it became obsolete when a superior approach was finally found. And the point that I like to make is that those mechanical systems were a 19th century solution to a 20th century problem, and what the situation required was an entirely different way of thinking to approach the problem.
Was this what they were called, the Nipkow discs, if I remember right? The Nipkow discs?
Yeah, Nipkow was a German engineer and inventor in the 1880s who was the first to propose the scanning disc approach to televising an image. So that literally does go back to the 19th century. And I don't think Nipkow ever built anything. His name was Paul Nipkow, but he proposed it. He may even have filed a patent for such a thing, but I don't believe he ever built such a thing. So it wasn't until we get into the 1920s that people start actually building machines using that approach.
Right. And when you say mechanical, somebody would stand and physically rotate it by hand?
No, it's an electric motor.
Okay.
Yeah, so you've got an electric motor spinning a disc on one end, creating a series of electrical pulses. They go to a spinning disc, a photocell, and an electric motor on the other end, and then reproduce that signal.
Right. Yeah. Just for the benefit of our viewers, I mean, I'm sure most people would know, but when you watch a video, obviously it consists of a bunch of frames, individual, succeeding photographs in different positions. Right. That are displayed at a specific speed called the frame rate. So it could be like 25 of them in a second or 30 of them in a second, and different standards. So a video essentially is a whole bunch of still photos rapidly displayed one after the other.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point about television is how to transmit it electronically from one place to the other, one location to the other, one device to the other. And that was the
Yeah.
problem they were trying to solve, right?
Well, I think in the example that you're drawing here, that film would actually be a better analogy to start, because film is actually recorded one frame at a time. And,
Right.
and so over the course of one whole second, you expose the film 24 times. And then when it is played back, it uses the phenomenon of vision called persistence of vision, where an image impressed on the retina remains long enough that by the time the next image is impressed, it creates the illusion of motion. So that's kind of the fundamental optical phenomenon that makes any of this motion picture technology work. But the problem with television is complicated by the fact that you can't transmit the whole frame at once. So it has to be broken down into much smaller component elements. And that's where we come to the idea of scanning the image somehow to produce a train of electrical impulses consistent with how light or dark the image itself is.
Right. So this is where I want to jump to the main topic, which is Philo Farnsworth.
Mm-hmm.
So you've written two biographies. One is Philo Farnsworth and one is Thomas Townsend Brown. And I can't help but when I just zoom out and look at their lives, they're both contemporaries, born within like a year of each other.
Yeah.
They were both like fascinated by electricity as young kids, and they were both doing experiments and self-taught. And both of them went to Germany, were involved in the war somehow, and
Yeah.
in some kind of way. And one of them, at least Townsend Brown, worked with the quote unquote deep state or secret society, like whatever apparatus. And if I understand right, Philo Farnsworth refused to work on the Manhattan Project, and there was also this ethical moral problem of we'll come to that later about when working on fusion, how that might be put to use and stuff like that. So that was really fascinating. So was there any design in this, or it just happened like that, like the biographies of those two people?
Well, I think there may have been a design, though we'd be talking about some kind of grand design beyond mere humans and their intentions on walking the earth. So it's useful that you point out that both of the subjects that I've written biographies of, Thomas Townsend Brown was born in 1905, and Philo Farnsworth born in 1906. So yes, very much contemporaries of each other, but most notably of the first generation after the adoption or introduction of quantum mechanics and relativity. Now, Einstein had his annus mirabilis, where he produced the 3 or 4 papers that produced the whole new paradigm of 20th century thinking in 1905. So somebody born in 1906, coming of age around 1920, or born in 1905, coming of age around the same age, they will be of the first generation that has never known a world that didn't have that knowledge in it. And so that informs their perspective on the way they approach problems of electrical engineering.
Right. When you say it's 3 papers, I think one is the special theory of relativity, and then the Brownian motion and photoelectric effect, right? Those are the 3.
There's 3 papers, and the order of them is significant. So, and I've studied this enough to be able to, I think, get it right. The first paper that Einstein published in 1905, and I can't do justice to the actual name of it, but it was essentially the articulation and quantification of the photoelectric effect. So even though people had been using that effect in older technologies, this was the first time it was spelled out very mathematically. And it gives us the introduction of the idea that light is both particle and wave at the same time. And embodied in that concept are the foundations of quantum mechanics.
Right.
So that's the first paper. The second paper, as you say, was the paper on Brownian motion, which confirms the existence of atoms, which at the turn of the century was still a source of some speculation. The third paper is the paper that introduces the subject of special relativity. And special relativity takes him to the fourth paper, and I'm not certain now if that was published in 1905 or came as a codicil two years later in 1907. But the fourth paper is the paper that describes the energy-matter equivalence or essentially E equals MC squared.
Right.
So I want you to just note for reference later in our conversation that is the path that Einstein followed in those early years. He started by defining the photoelectric effect, and that led him to E equals MC squared.
Right.
Right.
Which is kind of, we're going to draw a parallel, obviously, to Philo Farnsworth's TV to nuclear fusion.
Exactly. That's exactly the pattern that I'm inferencing, yes.
And not to mention, just a year or two before was the Wright brothers officially, quote unquote, launching their successful launch of the flying machine, wasn't it?
I'm
Somewhere
pretty
around
sure
that time.
Wright brothers was 1903.
Okay, just a couple of years
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking this was obviously the dawn of a century that would transform humanity, because people would move from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, and then already you're looking at television, and then all these new theories and classical to quantum mechanics. So
there were people born at the turn of the century who watched technology go from the Wright brothers to the moon over the course of their lifetime, and everything that entails in between.
Yeah. Also, once again, Philo Farnsworth. I know he made a comment when he watched the moon mission about and his work and how that contributed.
Yeah, we'll save that for the end.
Yeah.
We have decades of struggle to get through before that becomes a meaningful quote.
Yeah. So then I want to start off just to give people an understanding of this obscure but brilliant scientist who probably hasn't received the credit that he deserves.
No.
So he starts out, maybe if you want to just quickly take us through, he starts out as this farm boy who figures out electricity on his own, and then from there something happens, right?
Right. So the thumbnail sketch here is he's born in 1906 in Beaver Creek, Utah. The family is pretty hard scrabble, living a salt of the earth kind of existence. And the one source that they have that shows them what else is happening in the world is something we had in America called the Sears Roebuck Catalog, which was a common publication in many households that showed things like the phonograph was big at the time. We're talking about the first decade of the 20th century. Phonograph, the electric toaster shows up somewhere in this period, but that was the wish book, and that was where the Farnsworth family got their sense of what else was available in the world. The telephone, of course, was available by then, and that was his first exposure to the world beyond, and through other means he learned by how these things came into the world through invention. And he professed at a young age, based on that little bit of knowledge, his hope professed to his father his hope that he had been born an inventor. So he recognizes in an early age that this is not something that everybody can aspire to, but he then proceeds to educate himself to the extent that he can. The big turning point for him on this seminal journey is in 1918, when he's now about 11 or 12 years old, and the family relocates from Utah to a homestead in Rigby, Idaho. And the story is that as the little wagon train, covered wagons, comes over the crest of the hill to survey their new homestead, the adults are looking at the lay of the land and where they can plant crops and the structure of the landscape. But what 11 or 12-year-old Philo sees, that there are wires connecting two of the buildings. And he says, this place has electricity.
Right.
That was his first actual exposure to electricity, was at age 11 or 12. And then the family descends in and they take up their life on this new homestead. There is a Delco electric generator, which provides some crude electric lighting and powers a couple of the early machines of those days. And long story short, the machine breaks down, the generator breaks down a couple of times, and the adults try to fix it. When they can't fix it, young Philo asks for a chance, and he gets it fixed and becomes immediately installed at like 12 or 13 as the chief engineer of the Bungalow Ranch in Rigby, Idaho. So he's already showing he has some natural propensity toward this invisible phenomenon known as electricity.
Would you call him a prodigy, like a really talented person, or just someone who picked up and someone who had such curiosity that he just absorbed everything he saw and learned on his own?
to my inclinations, I think he goes beyond being simply a prodigy to being somebody who was divinely inspired. I have a book, I don't remember the author's name, but it's called The Soul's Code, this book that I have, and it presents the idea that certain people arrive on Earth with their soul encoded with certain information that needs to be conveyed to mankind. And I do believe that Philo Farnsworth was such a soul. And at a very early age, he shows this natural capacity for what is still a relatively new phenomenon in the world. We have not really electrified most of the country at this point, which is why it was so novel to arrive at this ranch in Idaho and find electricity.
Right. And then, of course, there's this famous incident in your book where he realizes, while I think he was in a potato field, it was, I think, around 1921.
Okay, so in America, when we talk about Idaho, we immediately assume potatoes, because for some reason Idaho is associated with potatoes. And it's unclear to me whether we're talking about a potato field or the farm also grew sugar beets, and I've heard both stories, but it's a field. Now, I have to set the stage for you before we can get to that moment of inspiration, because having expressed his desire to be an inventor, and then finding at the Bungalow Ranch in Rigby, Idaho, a trove of electrical magazines from the period, things like Science and Invention, published by a man named Hugo Gernsback. And if you ever heard of the Hugo Science Fiction Awards, that's who those are named for. He did radio and electronics and science publications in the 1920s. And that is what Farnsworth found, young Farnsworth, in the attic of the cabin at the Bungalow Ranch. And here is where he begins to really educate himself and learn everything that is going on in the realm of electricity and electronics. And that is probably where he discovered the idea of television, which, as I said earlier, was this idea that was in the firmament floating around that someday motion pictures would find a way to merge with radio and transmit motion pictures through the air. So when he comes across this idea, the way it was explained by the family to me, he arrives at the conclusion that if he wants to be an inventor, television might be a good thing to invent to launch such a career. So he's almost mercenary about it in that sense. This is what I'm going to do, and and proceeds to learn as much as he possibly can on the subject of how to transmit motion pictures through the air. He learns a lot about radio, became, as Townsend Brown became personally very proficient in radio, and uses that as a career skill later in his life. But he is somehow possessed of enough presence of mind that when he encounters the reports of those mechanical systems that we were talking about earlier, he can recognize right away that those are never going to work, or not work adequately to create an industry around. And in his studies, he learns of several subjects specifically. By then, we know of the existence of electrons. We did not know that electrons existed until 1897. So it's still very early in that process. The same year electrons were discovered, Karl Braun developed the first cathode ray tubes in Germany in 1897. And it was known that electron beams could be deflected by magnetic fields. So these are essentially the components that are crystallizing in his mind in 1920 or 1921 that he thinks might provide the solution to this problem of transmitting motion pictures through the air. And what I have to add here, so that we understand kind of the soup that we're swimming in here, is, remember, we're talking about somebody who was raised in the world of quantum mechanics and relativity. So he thinks he knows to look there for the solution. And I'm also
just quickly interrupt you there. Yeah. So I'm assuming he was I think around 13 or 14 years old around this time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where would a 14-year-old boy living on a farm come across, for example, a machine that does this, mechanically to know that this is a problem? Do you think he would have come across a machine already, where movie
No,
theaters are
he wouldn't have seen the machine. He would have seen the reports of it, the stories about it in the magazines that he found.
Okay.
Because you can find Gernsback magazines like Science and Invention that have illustrations of these machines. So that's how he learns of the concept of mechanical scanning. And then given his 20th century perspective, raised in the world that has found quantum mechanics and relativity, he comes at it from an entirely different angle. And he thinks that he'll find the solution there. And in fact, he finds the solution in Einstein's photoelectric effect. It's an interesting coincidence to me, but not a sequential one, that I love to ask people, do you know what Einstein won the Nobel Prize for? Now,
was
you might know, it was the photoelectric effect. Yeah, the trick, that's the answer to the trick question, because most people will think it was relativity, or E equals mc squared. But in 1921, Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect, which, as I said earlier, provided the foundations of quantum mechanics and relativity.
Right.
So you have to imagine now this teenager. He's, I think, 14 years old. We're in the early summer, sometime in the summer of 1921. And he set his mind on trying to find a solution to the problem of television. He's learned about electrons and cathode ray tubes and magnetic deflection. And all of this is simmering in his mind while he's trying to find some solution to this. And then the apocryphal story, the legend is that one hot summer afternoon, he is plowing a field in Rigby, Idaho. We don't know if it was a potato field or a sugar beet field, but it's a field. And there's dust flying around him, and it's hot and it's dusty. And the story is that late in the afternoon, he kind of turns around in the seat of his tiller, and he sees the parallel rows that he has plowed in the field. And that provides the moment of inspiration where he can see how he can scan an electrical counterpart of the physical image using a magnetically deflected beam of electrons in a cathode ray tube. There's a moment of inspiration, what inventors call the moment of conception, sometime in the summer of 1921. And I will add that the important detail to that, which was only going to be conceived by somebody who at that point was newly steeped in the sense of quantum mechanics and the photoelectric effect, was what he envisioned. The critical part of his vision was where the mechanical systems scanned the reflected light. His vision was to create an electrical counterpart to the optical image and scan that with a beam of electrons. That was a moment of pure genius.
Right. And I'm also fascinated by the amount of detail that we're able to gather here. So I know that in order to research for this book, I mean, you did it for over many years, and you spoke to his probably now deceased wife as well. But then, did he himself keep any notes or journals that give us details on exactly what happened at that moment?
Not at that moment, but shortly thereafter.
Okay.
And yes, I was very fortunate because I latched onto this story in 1975. Now, I first personally heard of Philo T. Farnsworth in 1973, which was 2 years after he had died, and then was motivated to track the family down to learn more of the story, perhaps because I was still working in television at the time and wanted to see if I could do the motion picture for television about the boy who invented it. So it was in 1975 that I met the family in Salt Lake City. And I became very good friends with the oldest son of Philo T. Farnsworth. We're talking about Philo T. Farnsworth II. His grandfather was Philo T. Farnsworth I, and then his oldest son was Philo T. Farnsworth III, and that was who I met in Salt Lake City, along with his widow, Pem Farnsworth, and their youngest son, Kent, in the summer of 1975. So this is where I began to get the sense of the true story behind all this, was because of the time that I was able to spend with them. But to answer your question about the disclosure, So there's the moment of conception, and then there's the moment of disclosure, and then finally there is the reduction to practice. That's kind of the steps that an invention will go through. So
Right.
the conception is in the summer of 1921, before his 15th birthday, because he remembers being 14 years old at the time. He was born in August. He carried that idea in his head, just thought about it for several months, and finally reached the point where there had to be somebody he could talk to just try and flesh it out. And he had managed to sweet talk his way into a senior chemistry class at Rigby High School, even though he was only a freshman. And the teacher of that class, a man named Justin Tolman, sort of took this young prodigy under his wing. So a trust bond was formed between the two of them. And so sometime in the late winter or early spring of 1922, Tolman comes back to his classroom after class has been dismissed, but finds his young prodigy at the chalkboard having drawn this diagram of something that he doesn't recognize. And the story is that Tolman asks his young student, who is Philo Farnsworth, "What's this?" And
Right.
Farnsworth puts down the chalk and says, "Well, this is my idea for electronic television." And Tolman has never even heard that word before and says, "Television? What's that?"
Right.
And young Philo Farnsworth proceeds to explain what television is, how it's been tried prior to that date, and that this is his idea for it. So at first it's on the chalkboard, and they talk about it for a while, and before they're done, Philo draws it out on a sheet of paper, in a sketch pad on a notebook, and, and tears it out and hands it out and says, "Just hang on to this. It might turn in useful someday." And that is why we still have that sketch today. So that's the first disclosure in 1922.
Right. And we know, we'll probably discuss it later, how important and useful that would turn out to be, in the whole scheme of things.
That's right. Yeah. That paper resurfaces during patent litigation in the 1930s.
Right. Which is probably going to be, we're probably going to just dwell on that a little bit more, because this is a classic story of David versus Goliath. That's phase two of the story. First, we have to get the thing. Remember, I said there was 3 steps, at least. Right.
There's the conception, the disclosure, and then the reduction to practice. So it's not a viable idea until you can get it to work. And here is where I think is the central thesis to this particular story. I'm very fond of a quotation which has been attributed to the physicist and philosopher Roger Penrose, though I can't say with any certainty that he said it. I'll have to ask him someday. But Penrose is reputed to have said, "To have the right idea is one thing, but to have the right idea and make it work is everything." And so now we're getting into the make it work phase of this process. And what's intriguing to me at this point in the story is we're talking about 1921 and 1922. He carries this idea in his head. He does as much research as he can. He spends some time as a freshman at BYU. He had a very not a checkered academic career, but it was very stop and go, because he didn't have the means to continue going to college. But he learned everything he could to try to inform himself, because he thinks he's got this idea that he not only thinks is going to be the path to television, but he expects that any day he's going to open some scientific journal and see that somebody else has made the same discovery.
Right.
And that goes on for another 4 or 5 years at least. I mean, from inception to reduction to practice turns out to be 6 years. And it's phenomenal to me that nobody came up with the same idea during all that time. And that's the measure of how far ahead of the rest of the industry he was at the time, because nobody else came up with that same idea until he finally gets some financing in 1926. He opens a laboratory in San Francisco in the fall of 1926. He starts fabricating tubes, and long story short, he is actually able to produce an image that is transmitted from the bottom of one vacuum tube and received on the bottom of another vacuum tube on September 7th, 1927.
Right. And that, you believe, it was the day television was born?
That's the day television, I like to say, arrived on the planet.
Right.
But
right.
that is the day that television, as we have come to know it over the course of the second half and first quarter of the 20th and 21st centuries, that is the moment of conception and realization of the technology from which we benefit so greatly today.
Right. And of course, modern television has moved to much higher beyond that with the LED and
Sure.
LCDs and the way they scan images and stuff. But
let me put it this way for you, because there's a chain of events that begins starting on 1927. So what I like to say is that September 7th, 1927 was television's Big Bang moment that led to a chain of events that over the course of the following decade produced practical technology that could be introduced after World War II. But September 7th, 1927 is the moment when it all began.
Right. And you mentioned that in the intervening years, nobody could think of something like that. Do you think he was also very secretive about it, or did he discuss his ideas with many other people, possibly?
He was mostly secretive about it.
Right.
Because he knew it was a fragile idea, but he had to tell people, like the backers that he found in San Francisco, he had to obviously share the idea with him.
Right.
And this will bring us back to that Penrose quote that I gave you before. There were other people who had similar but inoperative ideas. The idea of electronic television as opposed to mechanical television appears actually in the litany as early as 1907 or 1908. There's a man in England named A. Campbell Swinton who wrote a paper proposing using cathode ray tubes, and there was a man in Russia named Boris Rosing who made similar propositions. But neither of them built anything that worked. That's why the second half of the Penrose quote is so essential, because Farnsworth not only had the idea, which he arrived at entirely on his own, but he had the means, despite the lack of any formal education, to make it work. And that's why September 7th, 1927 is truly a pivotal date in human history.
Right. And just to quickly, you mentioned lack of a formal education. I just want to quickly also add, I must say, under difficult circumstances, because I know in the intervening years he lost his father in 1924.
Yeah.
And he had to be the sole breadwinner of the family, and he joined the army and somehow had to manipulate his way out of serving so that he could be back home and things like that. I'll let the viewers read the book to find out those details.
Yeah.
But then
it was actually the Navy, but since you bring it up, I just want to throw in one detail here. He was actually in the Navy in San Diego briefly, and it was when he was in the Navy that he dropped the O from his name. So he was no longer referred to as Philo. He started calling himself Phil. And as we get into the later stages of the story, we may refer to him as Phil. That's how you'll know that that's who we're talking about, because when I meet Philo III in 1975, he is known as Philo.
Right.
So Phil invented television. Philo was his youngest son that I met in 1975.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then of course he, 1927, this happens. And then it's interesting in the second phase with the whole controversy, David versus Goliath thing. You mentioned Rosin, and one of the main, quote unquote, I mean, I hate to use the word, is probably not that, one of the main villains of this piece, Vladimir, I forget his surname, what was it? Zvorsky?
No.
Zworykin?
Vladimir Kozma Zworykin, who was a student of Boris Rosing's in Russia in the early 1920s. We're talking about the years just after the Bolshevik Revolution. And Zworykin himself came from a family of some means, all of which was being appropriated by the revolution. So he left Russia in 1921 and came to the United States and eventually found employment with Westinghouse in 1923. And the complicating detail, what I like to think of as the primary false narrative in all this, begins in 1923 when Zworykin is working for Westinghouse, and for the sake of disclosure, to have a date on the idea, he in fact applied for a patent in 1923 for an electronic television system based on the ideas that he had gleaned from Boris Rosing, studying under him in Russia in the late 19 teens.
Right.
So,
right. And then he, of course, visits, I think, was it 1930 1930?
It's 1930 that you're thinking. All right, so let me just lay out the sequence of events here, because it's become increasingly critical to me, to this idea that 1927 is the Big Bang moment, because it launches a sequence of events. So Farnsworth applied for a patent in January of 1927, and then goes about building the device disclosed therein, which he demonstrates and reduces to practice in September of that year. So that patent, once something becomes a patent application, it's public knowledge. But my thinking is that it was not given much stead because of where it came from, and because there were patents applied for television systems, but nobody took them very seriously at the time.
Right.
Where the wheels start to turn is a year later, because Farnsworth was always underfunded, and so his backers press him to do a public demonstration, thinking that will make it easier for them to raise additional funds to continue the research. And I'll sidebar here, because here is where we immediately encounter the difference of purpose between the inventor and his backers. The inventor wants the means to invent things. The backers want to earn a profit. And so their purposes became bifurcated at that point. They were not on the same path.
Right.
So he does the public demonstration in September of 1928. It appears, we have copies, you can find this in the illustrations, of a headline in the San Francisco Chronicle from September 3rd, 1928, that says, "San Francisco's man invention to revolutionize television."
Right.
And it has a picture of Philo Farnsworth holding the camera tube that he calls the image dissector, and the cathode ray tube receiver, which he calls the cathode ray tube receiver he calls the oscillate. So that's the two ends of the complete system. And he has a picture of him in his laboratory with those two devices. So that's the public disclosure. And that story hit the wire services. So it seems reasonable to assume that is when the industrial forces on the East Coast learned what was happening 3,000 miles away on the West Coast. It was in September of 1928. And the person who would have been the most interested, and to me the real villain in the story, or as I like to call him, Darth Sarnoff, was the then ascendant general manager, not yet president, of the Radio Corporation of America.
Right.
And I'll give you a little backstory on RCA here, because it's critical to this story. RCA was formed in 1921 after World War I. During World War I, the military commandeered all the patents that belonged to American Marconi, covering wireless. And so the government controlled those patents during World War I. When the war was over, the government didn't need to control them anymore, so they spun them off into a new company, which was formed out of AT&T, General Electric, and Westinghouse. They became the chief shareholders in a new company called the Radio Corporation of America, which then became the holder of all the critical patents covering radio. And the guiding corporate principle of the Radio Corporation of America is: the Radio Corporation was formed to collect patent royalties, not to pay them.
Right.
So that's what we're coming up against here in the not too distant future. So television is invented in 1927. It's announced to the public in 1928. They learn about it on the East Coast at the end of 1928, and in January 1929, David Sarnoff has his first meeting with Vladimir Zworykin, who at the time is still working for Westinghouse.
Right.
And they decide, among other things, to maintain that arrangement, so that even though Zworykin may be beginning to develop some television ideas for RCA, he's still in the employ of Westinghouse.
Westinghouse, okay.
And that becomes the critical part of the story the next year, in 1930, when Sarnoff instructs Zworykin to visit Farnsworth's laboratory in San Francisco and see firsthand what has he really got.
Good old-fashioned corporate espionage.
Very much so, because when Zworykin arrives at Farnsworth's laboratory at 202 Green Street in San Francisco, he is coming under the guise of still working for Westinghouse. And
Right.
Westinghouse was a potential licensee. Remember, an inventor wants to keep inventing, so he wants to earn royalties from his patents.
Right.
The investors just want to sell the thing off and get their profit. So he's looking for companies that can license his patents and provide a royalty while they all continue to develop this technology, which clearly needs a lot of engineering once the principle has been proven.
Right.
And so Zworykin shows up under this pretense of investigating a patent license for Westinghouse, and he is shown everything that made real television possible in 1930.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And then
And
he,
in
of
fact,
course,
I'll forgive you. I'll let you follow up, but let me add two more stories while we're on the subject. There's
Yeah.
two, I think, very telling stories from this. My personal favorite, because it expresses the atmosphere at Farnsworth's laboratory, was by this time, Farnsworth and his brother-in-law, Pem's brother, Cliff Gardner, who is working as his principal glassblower, they have perfected the art of sealing flat glass in the end of a cylinder of glass.
Right.
Up until then, vacuum tubes had a dome. And in order to avoid any optical distortion, they needed to be able to seal a flat panel into the cylinder of the tube. Cliff perfected that technique.
okay.
And so when Zworykin is shown a finished image dissector tube, it has that flat optical glass sealed into the end. And then Cliff demonstrates for him how he manages to do that on what's called a glass lathe, which is like a circle of flames around the end of the tube. And
Right.
the glass is all melted together in those flames. And he hands that finished tube to Zworykin, and Zworykin says two things. In relation to the flat glass on the end of the tube, he says, well, my people told me this couldn't be done. And Cliff says, well, we didn't know it couldn't be done, so we just went ahead and did it.
Right. Right.
So that's the attitude that they're there. But the other thing that Zworykin says, which I think is the most telling, is he holds the image dissector in his hand and he says, and all the people here were witness to this, this is a beautiful instrument. I wish I'd invented it.
Right. Red flags right there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, 4 years later, he claimed that he had.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. He goes back and then he builds an exact replica of this.
Yeah.
And then claims
Before
it
he
to be-
left San Francisco, he dictated to his colleagues in Westinghouse a 300-word telegram. Now, telegrams, they were pricey things in 1930. So,
Right.
that's why they're all so short. A 300-word telegram with the precise specifications for how to build an image dissector tube. So that
Right.
when he went back to Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, he was able to pick up a finished image dissector tube of his very own, and then he went straight to Camden with it and began developing electronic television based on what he had learned from Farnsworth.
Did he also try to patent it as his own, or just commercially produce? Think.
This is where it begins to get very murky,
Right.
because he didn't. So that's 1930. I think we don't have documentation of this, I'll be clear about that, but he has the means now of producing an electronic television signal. So at the very least, on the receiving end, he can produce a much higher resolution image than he could a year earlier when he was still using mechanical scanners. So he has
Right.
the means now. But another thing that happens a year later is that David Sarnoff himself comes to visit Farnsworth's laboratory. So this is 1931, and Sarnoff sees what Farnsworth has developed, and says and offers $100,000 for this entire enterprise, which was arguably worth tens of millions, at least,
Right.
in 1930 dollars. And Farnsworth himself wasn't there at the time, but his backer, George Jefferson, was. And George said that Farnsworth would never accept a deal that forced him to work for RCA or any other employer, because Farnsworth valued his independence more than anything. So that deal was rejected. And as he's leaving, Sarnoff says, well, in that case, there's nothing here we'll need.
Right.
And so he returns to RCA on the East Coast, and Zworykin is given instructions to find a way around Farnsworth's patents. And this is how we get to a tube called the iconoscope, which is the foundation of what I call the false narrative.
Right.
Now, the iconoscope was fundamentally different from the image dissector that Farnsworth developed because it used something called the storage principle. And the best way I can illustrate this is when you're shooting film, it's going at 1/24th of a second through the shutters, or 24 frames a second. So each frame is in the shutter for a whole 24th of a second. So the light has it seems like a tiny fraction, but it has a 24th of a second to make a light impression on the film. That's kind of what the storage principle does in a television camera. So the light hits a mosaic of electrical components, what we would call pixels, essentially today, and the electrons that are generated from the photoelectric effect hitting that pixel have a moment to build up, like a 30th of a second. So there's more charge coming off. So you start with a stronger signal. Now, the knock on the image dissector that you encounter during this period, as we get into the 1930s and television being launched later in that decade, the knock on the image dissector was it was not light sensitive because it doesn't have that storage principle where the charge has a chance to build up for a fraction of a second. What's being scanned is the exact electrical value at the instant that it is scanned.
Right. So now, there's no delay.
There's no delay.
Right.
Yeah, there's no charge buildup in the delay. Now, that's an important departure for the story that we'll come back to later because what Farnsworth develops is an amplifying system based on something called secondary electron emissions. We don't have to get into that now.
Right.
But with the mandate to build a tube that gets around Farnsworth's patents, Zworykin introduces in 1931 or 32, the year is uncertain, but we can say for certainty by 1932, this tube called the iconoscope. Another sidebar. That storage principle that I just described to you, which becomes the central focus of the iconoscope, was not developed by Vladimir Zworykin. That was developed by a Hungarian engineer and inventor named Kalman Tiani.
Okay.
RCA acquired those patents and handed them over to Zworykin, and Zworykin went to work on that tube. So by the time he's demonstrating the iconoscope in 1932 or 1933, he has his own operative electronic television camera tube.
Right.
But there's a problem with the date of disclosure of electronic television. Farnsworth's date is 1927, or that's the date that it becomes formal with the patent application.
Right.
Zworykin had an application for an electronic television system from 1923.
Right.
So here is where things begin to get pretty dicey. Because the embodiment of the central principle in Farnsworth's 1927 to 1930 patent, which by 1932 has been a valid patent, an issued patent for 2 years because it was issued in 1930, was what I was describing earlier as that principle of the electrical image, where you create the counterpart to the optical image and scan the electrons coming off that electrical image. So that is described in very precise language in Farnsworth's first patent, 1773-980. There's no such description in Zworykin's 1923 application, which in 1932 is still just an application. That's Zworykin bringing an idea to the patent office and saying, "Can I have a patent, please?" And at this point, the patent office has not said yes. So the story is that RCA is keeping the rest of the industry that might have any interest in Farnsworth's work at arm's length because they are telling the rest of the industry, no, we control the patents for television, based on Zworykin's 1923 application.
Right.
So at this point, there's the 1923 application and there's the 1932 iconoscope. They're not the same thing. But RCA will make the case over the next however many years that they are. So where things come to loggerheads is in patent litigation in 1934, which is actually initiated by Farnsworth. Farnsworth takes RCA to court so that they can establish their date of priority. And in the course of the litigation, RCA tries to make the case that the iconoscope, the tube that they have now, does the same thing that the image dissector does, which is create the electrical image and scan the electrical image. That became the critical wording over which the patent litigation was conducted. Right. And RCA needed that language in order to have any kind of control of television and in order to be able, according to its corporate mandate, to collect the royalties for television that it is expected to collect. So that litigation is engaged in 1934, and that's why I say he held the image dissector in his hand, said, I wished I'd had invented it, and then 4 years later in the litigation, he's claiming that he had. Right. And the litigation revolves around that one claim 15 in the patent. And long story short, when the litigation is finally resolved in the spring of 1935, the patent office declares uncategorically that invention belongs to Philo T. Farnsworth. And more specifically, it goes into the details of Zworykin's patent application from 1923 and says not only would the device disclosed in that application not have worked in the manner disclosed in the claim 15, but it would not have worked, period. It was an inoperable device. Now, that happens all the time. People have an idea, they file a patent, it never pans out, the patent is never granted. Right. And that was the case with Zworykin in 1935. That patent still hadn't been granted.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, he won the case famously because we made this point earlier, because he had made that little sketch of this device and left it with his chemistry teacher.
Yeah. The attorneys for RCA are very dismissive, shall we say, to be charitable, of Farnsworth's claim that he had this idea when he was a teenager, when he was 1921, and so he's kind of pestered on it. Well, did you tell anybody? And he says, yeah, I told my high school science teacher. So all the attorneys for both sides go out to Salt Lake City together. This is the litigation is happening, I guess, in Washington. They go to Salt Lake City together on a train. And they find Justin Tolman. And he's like tending the roses in his garden. And they start to ask him questions. And he says, well, yes, I remember Philo very well. He was the smartest student I ever had. And begins to say more than they want to have him say at the time. So they immediately stop him and say, can you meet us at this law office the next day? And they do. They depose Justin Tolman. And in the course of that deposition the next day, Tolman reaches into his pocket and holds out the diagram that Philo had drawn for him. I guess it would have been 12 years earlier in 1922. So that's why we have that sketch today, because Tolman introduced it in the litigation in 1934. So with that information, Farnsworth and his attorneys were able to make a better case that he had, in fact, had this idea when he was just a teenager.
Right. And then of course he won that, and then he was given what was it called? The first like a recognition of priority over invention.
Right. The last sentence in the patent litigation, the interference, is priority of invention is awarded to Philo T. Farnsworth. So at that point, you can arguably say that Farnsworth is essentially declared the de facto father of television. It's recognizing the creation of the electrical image in the image dissector tube as the essential ingredient to making an electronic television picture. So that's the foundation of the industry that we are living in the firmament of today.
And from that point, before we quickly move on to the next phase, from that point, when do you think that a version of the modern cathode ray television that people started recognizing in living rooms. When did that appear? Was it like shortly after, or did that still take a lot of time?
That's all during this period, because remember, he invents the camera tube, but he also invents the cathode ray tube receiver.
Right.
And right. It was a tiny thing at the time, but that technology evolved very quickly. So, but actually, Farnsworth did a public demonstration of television at the Franklin Institute in 1934. And there are photos of him standing next to the display he used. It was described as being the size of a 10-gallon jug. And so it's a screen about this big. It's like a 12 or 15-inch screen. So you would recognize that as early as 1934 as the kinds of cathode ray tubes that became the foundation of the television industry until it began to go into other technologies in the 1990s, essentially. But for like 60 years, the cathode ray tube was the foundation of television, and that took its form in the 1930s.
Right. But I guess, quickly, what I meant was the commercial production and distribution of a device such as that. Like where it found itself in people's... Well, see,
and here again is where we run into what I call the false narrative, at least in America. Because in 1939, so this is another critical turning point, RCA at this point was spending millions of dollars trying to get around Farnsworth's patents. And my understanding is that David Sarnoff, who is now the president of RCA, and spending money just lock, stock, and barrel, hand over fist, began to get pressure from his board of directors to do something, to have something to show for all this. And so the turning point is at the New York World's Fair in April of 1939. Sarnoff stages what I consider a big publicity stunt, a charade, to introduce television as to the world. And that is remembered in America as having been the launch of commercial television at the New York World's Fair in 1939, where Sarnoff says, now we add sight to sound. But in fact, it was not the introduction of commercial television, because by this time in America, the Federal Communications Commission has taken its mandate to include television and is not permitting any kind of commercial broadcasting. So I really think of this as the beginning of television's false dawn from 1931 until after World War II, in which a limited portion of the public who could afford the very expensive devices were allowed to participate in the continued experimentation by having a receiver in their home. But in America, commercial broadcasting doesn't really start until 1941, then it's almost immediately precluded by the advent of World War II and doesn't start in earnest until after World War II.
Right.
But again, that 1939 is another date in that litany of the false narrative. That is also the year, notably, when Sarnoff and RCA had to finally capitulate. They had spent so much money and needed to get television off the ground in order to show some return on its investment that in the fall of 1939, RCA finally accepts a patent license from Farnsworth Television and Radio. It is the first time in RCA's corporate history of now approaching 20 years that it has ever agreed to pay an inventor a royalty for the use of his patents.
Right.
And then, and the reason for that was because that electrical image that I was talking about was the central component of a whole new television camera tube called the Image Orthicon, which is based primarily on Farnsworth patents.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's very fascinating.
That gets us to World War II.
Yeah. And of course, there are a lot of details which I really encourage people to, actually read the book and get to, and we don't want to just essentially go over the book.
Yeah,
here.
We've spent an hour on this subject, and it's still just a thumbnail sketch.
Yeah. I want to get to the what you might call the third phase, the juicy part of where he went from there, because at some point I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well,
at some point I think
we consider this the second phase.
Okay.
Where he begins to use all the knowledge that he has used over the course of now 15 years or so, developing television to essentially follow the rest of Einstein's path to a form of nuclear energy.
Right. And I don't know at what point this comes. It's somewhere in your book. He also gets disgusted by what he sees has happened to television, right? With the programming and how it's being used and not what he intended. So there's a whole curve. He invents it and then struggles through to claim that it's his, and then finally also wants to just let go of it and move on to different things.
Well, we're talking about one of the most intelligent people that ever walked the earth, frankly. And so when he saw most of what was being programmed on television for commercial television through the 1950s, he found little use for most of it. And there is a somewhat famous story of one time he's in his chair and he gets up out of the chair. And I think this would have been when they were in Fort Wayne, so it would have been in the 1950s. Some game show or something is on the TV. He gets out of the chair, he turns the TV off, and he says, "That's it. There's nothing here. There's nothing here that is worthy of your intellectual diet." And the television didn't come back on for years after that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he went on to famously study cosmology and relativity.
Yeah. So this is where the story takes its most, what I think is its most. This is a fascinating story up to this point, because you could argue that if you take Farnsworth out of the arc of history, you and I are talking to each other on the telephone.
Right. Would you even compare him to Tesla or that level of intelligence, genius?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would compare him in the same breath to Tesla and Einstein.
Right.
And I as I learned this story, I was more inclined to think of him, whereas Einstein was the brains, Farnsworth was kind of the hands.
Right.
Who made the stuff that Einstein was conceiving theoretically. And that becomes even more evident as we get into what his oldest son, Philo III, called the second case, which is
and of course
nuclear fusion.
Einstein. Sorry,
go
of course,
ahead.
Phil and Einstein did talk to each other on the phone for
that comes a couple of years later. So the important juncture here is, by the time the patent license is signed in New York in 1939, Farnsworth has already begun to withdraw himself from that scene. The financing is arranged in 1938 to acquire a radio and phonograph manufacturing plant in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the Capehart Company. That becomes the foundation for the Farnsworth Television and Radio Company that is listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 1938, so it's a part of the whole corporate structure now. Farnsworth really didn't have any interest in manufacturing. He was an inventor. Right. And so he began to withdraw himself from the process. And by 1939, 1940, he has retreated to a farm that he has found in Maine. And he can sense, as many people can, that there's a war coming on, and he thinks that's where he'll probably spend at least the next several years. Right. And in fact, that war starts in Europe in 1939 and comes to America with Pearl Harbor in 1941. And by then, he is fully ensconced on this homestead in Maine, where he has built himself a laboratory that is funded by the plant back in Fort Wayne so that he can continue. And among the things he's exploring are radar. There's a sidebar story here where he came up with some technology that was instrumental to radar, but we don't have to get into that. But he has already turned his attention. The best way to explain it is he has been propelled along the same path as Albert Einstein. Where right. Albert Einstein started with the idea of the photoelectric effect and how to convert light into electricity, that led him over a series of steps to the energy contained within an atomic nucleus that is released according to the formula of E = mc squared. And that is the concept that has similarly caught Farnsworth's imagination as we get into the early 1940s. Fission right. was discovered in Germany in 1938. The idea that a bomb could be built from this, Einstein himself professed to Roosevelt in 1939.
Right.
And so he is now comfortably ensconced on this farm in Maine, and he receives a visitor sometime in 1941. And the visitor asks him if he would have any interest in being part of a completely secret classified project in New Mexico. And Farnsworth turns to his wife and he says, "I think they're trying to build an atomic bomb, and I want no part of it."
Right.
So this essentially makes Philo Farnsworth the most prominent scientist or physicist of the day who was not part of the Manhattan Project. But he is turning his attention in an entirely different direction. Because when we're talking about the first atomic bomb or Fermi's pile in Chicago, which was part of the Manhattan Project, we're talking about fission, the splitting of atoms, and the difference in the mass being given off as energy. But by then, the concept of fusion is also known, and known to have more potential than fission. But it presents a much more fundamental problem than splitting atoms.
Right.
So,
do you think this rejection caused him to lose his fame? Was there some kind of conspiracy there, or nobody knows about him because he rejected that, or like an Oppenheimer?
Okay, so that's a question that I have three answers for. So why are we sitting here in the year 2026 having no knowledge of this man, what he contributed, how he changed the world, or the fact that the centennial of that event is coming up in a year? There's three answers to that question. And the first is that he himself was not inclined to dwell on past achievements. He was very much a forward-looking guy. He enjoyed the publicity that he did get in the 1930s. And he did have a little bit of fame. There's magazine articles about him. And at the time, he was regarded as the man who had invented television in the mid-1930s. But he's already focused in a different direction. So that's Farnsworth himself. The second, as we've discussed, is the pretenders to the throne, which go everywhere from John Logie Baird and his obsolete mechanical systems to people like Vladimir Zworykin and RCA, who would like us to think that they invented television in 1923 based on that patent, which was ruled inoperative in 1935. So there's various pretenders to that throne. But the third and most important reason is that he was simply not survived by a company that could promote his legacy.
Right.
That company folded in 1949. The Farnsworth Television and Radio Corporation, which I mentioned earlier, which was formed with Wall Street Capital in 1938 and moved to Fort Wayne. He worked there briefly and then went to Maine. They did very well during World War II, producing material, electronics, and radar equipment for the war effort, but they took on a lot of added capacity. And they were stuck with that capacity when the war ended. The production fell. They found themselves in some debt. They tried to sell off assets. Again, long story short, the company faltered in 1949, and what remained of it was acquired by the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, or ITT, in 1949. Right. And at that point, Farnsworth's fate is kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Farnsworth's fate is closed. He is now an employee of another company for the first time in his life, and would remain so for the rest of his life. And that's a factor in the story that unfolds as we get into the 1950s and 60s, because he no longer had the power or the authority to do what he wanted to do, which is what he was after from the very beginning. And now we begin to see the consequences of how that turned out. So. So in answer to your question, why don't we know this story? It's because primarily there was no company to carry his legacy. Right.
And you briefly mentioned, you brought in the concept of nuclear energy, fission and fusion. And before we go ahead, I just want to, for people who are listening in and watching, just explain very briefly. Of course, I'm oversimplifying. So when people talk about nuclear energy, fundamentally, maybe there are two ways in which you can extract energy. One is to take a heavy element and break it down, and it releases a neutron which hits another one and another one, so it causes this chain reaction. Yeah. And then it releases an energy, which is nuclear fission with an Fi, which gives you radioactive waste. And then the reverse of that, which is the inverse of that, which is the fusion, where you take smaller elements and try to fuse them together into a heavier element, which I think most commonly, the most easily accessible, even in terms of energy threshold, is like deuterium and tritium, like of hydrogen, isotopes of hydrogen, which are very abundant in seawater. Mm-hmm. So you take a smaller, it's like, imagine you take small pieces of stones and build a bigger rock, where you do the opposite in fission. But then the problem with and fusion would generally be considered.
Let me elaborate on your explanation a minute, so your listeners will have a better understanding of the problem. When we talk about nuclear energy, we're talking about the energy content of the nucleus of an atom. Right. And bear in mind that when we talk about the nucleus, we're talking about a bundle of positively charged or neutrally charged, but positively charged particles, protons.
Right.
The tendency of like-charged particles is to repel each other. So if you've ever held two magnets together, you know on a very physical, you've held the two north or south poles of a magnet together, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can't get them together because they have the same physical force.
Right.
So nevertheless, all matter is composed of atoms that are composed of nuclei where those like particles are somehow fused together. And the reason they're fused together is because they are governed by something called the strong nuclear force. There is one force in the universe that is stronger than the tendency of like-charged particles to repel each other, and that is the binding power of atoms.
Right.
So that's what we're after here. That's where we get the E equals mc squared. When you describe fission, what you're talking about is you start with a mass of 1, you split it, and you wind up with a mass in two particles that is less than 1. So you've got like you start out with 1.0 and you wind up with 0.4 and 0.4. That doesn't add up to 1. That difference is given off as energy according to the formula E equals mc squared. The reverse is what happens in fusion. You start with a particle of hydrogen, as you mentioned, deuterium or tritium, which are isotopes with neutrons attached, and you have to force them together. Well, they're not going to come together. But in celestial objects like stars, that happens on a regular basis. That's why we have physical universes, because of the power of nuclear fusion.
Right.
But when the two particles, the two lighter atoms, are fused, you start with, let's say, you start with 1 and you add 1, but what you wind up with is 1.5. That difference is given off as energy. And I'm being very broad in the explanation here, but I'm just going to say there's a difference in the resultant particle content, whether it's fission or fusion, and that's the difference that's given off as nuclear energy. So now we're beginning to understand the challenge of fusion. Fission is relatively simple because you just get the particles, the uranium, the plutonium, you get it in sufficient proximity to each other that the neutrons generated by the radioactive decay begin to hit the nuclei and give off more atoms. If you do all that in an instant, it's an atomic bomb. If you control that with carbon rods or something, then you can control the amount of energy. So that's the difference between explosive fission and controlled fission. Now, we do have a form of fusion in the world. It's called explosive fusion. It's what we know as the hydrogen bomb.
Right.
And the conditions needed to produce a hydrogen bomb are so extreme. You know how we trigger a fusion bomb, a hydrogen bomb?
I would imagine extreme temperature and pressure.
With a fission bomb. So every hydrogen bomb is a hybrid. It's a hybrid of a conventional atomic fission bomb and the fusion fuel in the form of a lithium deuterium that then explodes and implodes and produces a much bigger explosion. So we have controlled fission, we have explosive fission, we have explosive fusion. What we don't have is controlled fusion. Now, the appeal of controlled fusion, as you were saying earlier, is that it offers the potential of a much cleaner source, of an enormous source of energy. It's not absolutely clean until you get into the later stages of it, but it's much cleaner than fission because you have no dangerous fuel to begin with, and you have none of the toxic waste products that will last 100,000 years. So it's relatively cleaner, and the potential fuel for it, as you say, can be derived from seawater by distilling the deuterium isotopes out of seawater. Tritium is a little harder to come by, but it's useful in the experimental stages. So there is this promise to nuclear fusion, which has been hanging over science now for easily 80 years. We've got 1, 2, and 3, but we can't figure out 4. And the reason we can't figure out 4 is because a fusion reaction is essentially a star.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, how do you bottle a star? Right. What kind of container can you build where the heat of the star doesn't destroy the container, nor the walls of the container extinguish the star. And science has been trying to solve that riddle for 80 years. And I think there is a case we can make that Philo Farnsworth solved that riddle in the 1950s.
Right. And this is
That's why we're here today.
Yes, yes. So I know that a lot of people are aware of, for example, so just to step back a little bit, in order to fuse them together, you of course need like 100 to 150 million degrees Celsius of temperature and extreme conditions to keep them together. So, which creates plasma, which is the fourth state of matter. So the idea is, how do you contain the plasma, right? And plasma containment could be, I think they talk of magnetic containment, applying magnetic fields. And I think one thing that Philo did was to come up with what they call the inertial electrostatic containment, right? That was the solution.
IEC, right. So you've described the conventional approach. Remember at the very beginning of this conversation when we were talking about the mechanical television systems and how they were reflective of the thinking of the day, and that it took an entirely new kind of thinking to find the solution that they were looking for?
Right.
So you mentioned magnetic containment. So basically, to the known orthodox world of science, there are two approaches to nuclear fusion. One, as you mentioned, is magnetic confinement, and the other is inertial confinement, but not inertial electrostatic. Inertial confinement is when you use an array of laser beams to fire an intense jolt of energy into a tiny pellet of fusible material, and then that will implode and release nuclear energy. And in that instance, there was an event, I think 3 years ago now, at the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore in Berkeley, California, where they managed to fire up this array of lasers, fire it at a pellet of fusion fuel, and actually get more energy out of the resultant reaction than went into creating the reaction. Now, that was touted publicly as the first time we'd ever gotten more energy out of a nuclear fusion reaction than went into it. That's a dubious claim because so much energy went into creating the laser beams, but we're only accounting for the energy of the laser beams going into the pellet. And the other thing is that it was an instantaneous reaction. It was all released at once. And so to me, that's not so much a controlled fusion reaction where you're drawing the energy off over time. That's a miniature hydrogen bomb using lasers as the trigger rather than a fission bomb. So, so most of the money that has been being spent on fusion, and we're now talking billions, literally tens of billions of dollars, use these monolithic machines called a tokamak, which is a giant, I like to say that tokamak is a Russian word that means whirling hot donut.
Okay.
Because what the tokamak is essentially, it's configured like a donut, but you're not interested in the hole in the middle. Within the donut are huge magnetic fields that compress the plasma. Now, the plasma is the state of matter that exists when the electrons are separated from the nucleus. You now have the fourth state of matter where it's all swimming in this hot soup called plasma. So in order for the magnetic approach for fusion to work, you have to reach the three Lawson criteria. Let me see if I can remember what they are. So they are temperature, density, and containment. So you have to get it really hot. You have to get the particles really close together, and then you have to use the magnets to keep it all away from the walls of the container. And so what you wind up with are these incredibly expensive machines costing hundreds of millions, not hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars to first inject the electric current that is then broken down into the plasma, and then by other means get the plasma close together and then form these gigantic magnetic fields and keep it whirling around the electric donut. And it's a monolithic approach to what is arguably a relatively simple problem. it's a relatively simple problem if you approach it from the right attitude or from the right angle. But that is the orthodox approach. That's where I saw a number recently that there are commercial interests in fusion now that will spend upwards of $6 billion this year trying to approaches like that to fusion. So I liken those to the mechanical approaches to television. Let's take what we know and try to solve that problem based on what we know, when what we really need is something that is not common knowledge. And my overriding understanding of this is that based on the experience that he gained from 10 years, 15 years of perfecting television, Farnsworth arrived at the new knowledge that is going to ever be needed if we're ever going to have controlled nuclear fusion. And he developed that. He developed purely theoretically while he was in Maine in the 1940s, and it was still a purely theoretical idea when he met Einstein. He didn't meet Einstein, but he talked to Einstein on the phone about it in 1948.
So basically, he came up with a new method called the inertial electrostatic containment, which
confinement. Yeah,
he actually found a way to do it.
There is no question that he found a way to control nuclear fusion. And the devices that he and his team were building starting in around 1959 and going into the mid-1960s produced manageable, controllable nuclear fusion reactions, that were sustainable and readily controllable by the operator for long periods of time. Minutes at least, or longer if they want it. Here is the next level of challenge when we talk about nuclear fusion.
Right.
Fusion is unlike fission because in fission, as in with fossil fuels, the energy is contained naturally and needs to be released. In fossil fuels, it's burned off. In fission, you light a spark and the fuel builds. The fuel burns because the energy is contained therein. In a fission reactor, the energy is right there, and you release it slowly by controlling the proximity of the atoms to each other with control rods. But in fusion, there is no inherent energy. It doesn't exist until you get the particles to collide. And to get the particles to collide takes a lot of effing energy.
Right.
As we talked about, it takes enormous heat, magnetic fields, forces to control density. So it takes a lot of energy. The problem is that with the approaches to fusion that we know of, we're not able to get more energy out than we get in. And you would need to get a lot more out for it to be a practical source of any kind of electrical energy. At least 10, maybe 20. So that's why they made such a big deal of the experiment in Lawrence Livermore, where they claimed to get more energy out than in for the first time, because that enabled them to keep getting funding for these experiments.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to say, also, what are the chances that if you confine this within a space, what are the chances that they actually come and collide and fuse rather than just bounce off each other or lose energy and heat? Right? What's the probability?
That's a very interesting question, because it takes me to the foundation of Farnsworth's solution. And you'll be surprised what the source is, and I will probably run to the limit of my ability to explain these things once I get to this subject.
Right.
Farnsworth studied the work of an 18th century mathematician. His last name was Poisson, Poisson, and I'm not remembering his first name at the moment, but he was an 18th century French mathematician who dealt on probabilities.
Right.
And he used that as the foundation of his approach to fusion, because he was looking for a natural way to increase the probability that particles would fuse. And in fact, he named the phenomenon at the center of his device. It's called the fusor, F-U-S-O-R. And the star-like shape at the center, where the atoms are in fact fusing, he called the Poisson, named after this French mathematician. So the best I'm able to answer your question as to what makes it work is that it's embodied in that equation that explained to him what he could expect in terms of probabilities that the particles would come close enough together that the strong nuclear force would fuse them. That's what happens is those particles get close enough together that something else takes over and causes them to fuse. They get close enough that the strong nuclear force appears.
Right.
And the difference is given off as energy.
Right.
And that is happening. We have people around the world now that are building amateur fusers based on a very scaled down version of the Farnsworth fuser. You can find them at fuser.net. They are able to make that phenomenon happen. It's at a very low level. We're putting in 100 watts and getting back a fraction of a watt. So
Right.
it's nowhere close to break even, but it's sustainable. Fusion is happening in these things.
Again, such a fascinating parallel with Townsend Brown. A lot of people making lifters, right? Jean-Louis Danton's lifters.
Yeah.
And, people able to make these, asymmetric capacitor crafts in their lab and at home.
Yeah.
It's very similar to that. People being able to make, can you imagine nuclear fusion reactors at home?
It is imaginable. It would be a long way off. There is a form of fusion that involves what's called a fuel cycle, a combination of fuels, which would be aneutronic. It would be much safer. It uses boron in a hydrogen atom. Boron is a solid that can be burned off into a gas, but its nucleus is 5 protons, which gives it 5 times the Coulomb effect. Is going to be 5 times as hard to fuse. So it's like we got to figure out how to do this first, and then we can begin to improve it over time. So it is imaginable that sometime in the distant future we might have miniature boron hydrogen fusion reactors in our basements like we have a furnace now, but I'm not predicting it.
Right. Okay. So just to quickly skip a lot of technical details, just to step back and sort of give an understanding. So basically, he figured out a way to do it, and then I know that there were 2 instances in the book that you mentioned, 1963 and 1965, probably more, where they could actually see that even after shutting down the power input, it was able to sustain itself as a ball of,
There is a certain level of what I can only describe as mythology that begins to surround the Farnsworth project.
Right.
And when I first heard the story, I'll tell you a quick version of the apocryphal story that I heard in 1973, 2 years before I met the Farnsworth family. I met somebody who knew indirectly Philo III and so knew the fusion work. And it was described to me as you imagine a laboratory, a young man is outside the laboratory watching his father produce the impossible star in a jar. And after he's made it work, he removes a part from it and puts it on a high shelf where nobody will ever find it. That's how I was introduced to this story. And when I met Philo III 2 years later and asked him about that story, he said the story is kind of apocryphal, but where it bears truth is that the patents that were obtained in 1968 are incomplete. So this is the first layer of the myth. A patent is supposed to explain to somebody who is knowledgeable in the art how to build and operate the device therein. And so they did apply for a patent in 1966. It was granted in 1968. It's a really cool looking illustration. But if you try to build it, it's not going to operate the way it was intended because something is missing from that patent. So that's one facet of the mythology. The story that you're talking to is the story that Pem Farnsworth herself told me in, I think, 1989. Now, at this point, I had known the Farnsworth family somewhat intimately for 15 years. And they were always very guarded about the fusion years. Now, you could argue that they were guarded about the work because, it didn't pan out, it wasn't ever going to work, and they wanted to protect his reputation. But there are aspects of the story that compel me to think otherwise. And the story that I heard that you were describing a moment ago, which is in the book, also in Pem's book, it is sometime in, I think, 1965. It could be 1966. I don't have the exact date. But that was kind of like the peak years. And they've got some really cool-looking fusion devices that they're operating. Very small. A core to the device, a spherical core, is maybe the size of a basketball. not much larger than that, maybe smaller. And there are competing teams. Remember now I told you we're working for ITT. ITT doesn't want to fund this research. They're getting their money from the Atomic Energy Commission. The Atomic Energy Commission doesn't want to fund this research. So it's a very contentious kind of environment. And Farnsworth is being very guarded about what he wants to do and what's happening in the lab. So it's in this context that he comes home after work one night, and Pam describes he has a very unusual look on his face. And she asks him what's up, and he says, well, I saw something today, and I'd like you to see it. So they go back to the lab after hours that night. And the way Pam describes it, I hope I can do justice to this. She sits down at a bank of meters while he sits at the controls, and I imagine it was throttles, but it may have been dials. So just imagine something, he's pushing these throttles up. And one controls voltage, one controls amperage. There's also a certain amount of vacuum involved, but they're relatively simple controls. And the way Pam describes it is the needles on the meters that she's looking at get up to about 3/4 of their trajectory. And Phil says, okay, where are the needles? And she says, well, they're about 3/4 up. And then he makes some kind of adjustments.
Right.
And I don't know if
what do these meters measure? What do these meters measure?
Voltage and amperage.
Okay.
At least. And I think there's something, at least voltage and amperage. I'm not precisely sure. It's an apocryphal story. I don't need to have the details. I am not telling a scientific story here. I'm telling an apocryphal story. So the needles are at 3/4. Then Phil makes some adjustments. And Pam calls out, they've gone off the scale. The needles have pegged.
Wow.
And then Phil withdraws the power. And the needles stay pegged. And he comes over and he stands with Pam at the needles and he watches them as they stay pegged for about 30 seconds. And then they slowly begin to come back down. Now, I've described to you what somebody described to me as their experience. I cannot for a moment tell you what is going on in terms of what happened in that reaction.
Sure.
But when the needles finally settled down, Phil said to Pam, that's all I need to see. Let's go home.
Right.
And the story is that he began withdrawing himself from the ITT fusion research at that point. There's some health issues, but that is the beginning of the end, from our point of view, of the ITT fusion research project that produced the inertial electrostatic confinement device called the fuser.
Right. So I guess what we could sort of venture to guess is that he put some of his principles to use and he could see that he had actually cracked something that other people haven't, and he knows that it is possible. But then he was, I know it's also probably addressed in your book, he was also worried about the ethical implications, moral implications of where this could go.
Let's come back to that, because I want to answer your question to what we might be able to surmise was going on there. And I've done some research into this in the past couple of months because this topic is beginning to warm up some. The problem, the inherent problem in the fuser, remember we were talking about those probabilities before?
Yeah.
The inherent problem in the fuser is that the probabilities are so low that you'll be able to get the ions close enough to each other to fuse that there are enormous losses. There are more ions that bounce off each other and hit the walls of the container by enormous numbers than there are the ions that actually fuse to cause what little energy we're able to get at this level. So that's the losses problem. And the common experience, particularly with these amateur fusers, which have a very different kind of architecture to them, is that the more you turn up the power, you'll start to get a little more fusion and a lot more losses. So it's kind of working against you as you go along. So the best that I can surmise that he may have observed that would have justified, that's all I need to see, let's go home now, is that he saw a path toward a more sophisticated level of confinement. That something that he did there told him that something that he suspected was true. He had enough evidence that he was on the right path, that then the other factors that you're discussing, the ethical factors of whether humanity is ready for this, whether he wanted his company to have control of this, issues like that become a factor, and he is seen to walk away from the program.
Absent any evidence of any concerted effort from the military or deep state to acquire this and hide the information, what is stopping, do you think, so many people, so many scientists, freelancers people who can spend money from actually finding out how to do it so many years down the line?
Well,
because the patents exist.
It's interesting that you ask that question now, because I am arguably on the threshold of doing something about it. I have, for as long as I've known this story, had a pipe dream about a way to fund this research. Now, there are stories in the books about why the project came to an end, and it has all to do with the sources of funding. And one story in particular where the concept is presented to the Atomic Energy Commission, and the people on the Atomic Energy Commission all represent their own approaches to fusion, and whoever is chairing the meeting leans back and says, okay, whose budget is this going to come out of? And when nobody volunteers a portion of their budget, the project comes to an end. So there's a challenge of orthodoxy versus peripheral knowledge, and the orthodoxy always seems to win. And as we talked about earlier, there are now billions of institutional and venture capital money being spent on these monolithic approaches to fusion. And you're probably familiar with Sabine Hassenfelder.
Yep.
Look at the piece she did. It's probably been a month, maybe 6 weeks ago, where she begins to talk about how some of these fusion startups, the ones that are spending tens to hundreds of $1 million, like Commonwealth Fusion Systems and Helion, they're beginning to have a problem because they're not able to deliver on the investment. And they probably never will. But it's promising technology, and so people are willing to invest venture capital money into it. But they're running into the wall that people like John Logie Baird ran into in the 1920s. It's just not going to deliver.
Is this the string theory of fusers?
That might be giving it a little too much credit, because at least I don't think anybody's spending billions of dollars building a string theory machine.
Okay.
In France right now, they're building the world's largest tokamak fusion reactor to the tune of somewhere between $20 and $40 billion.
Wow.
So the pipe dream goes like this. We are now beginning. Sabine Hoffenfelder in her new video makes the case that there is no path forward for profit-motivated venture capital investment in nuclear fusion. So I make the argument that what we need is an open-ended, long-term endowment approach that spends money that is spun off from a body of capital at a very modest rate so that we can revisit this approach. Now, when I talk about the guys that populate Fuser.net, about 150 of which have built their own fusion reactors, according to specifications produced by a colleague of Farnsworth's named Robert Hirsch and Gene Meeks. That's the very low-scale demonstrator. Nobody's actually built a Farnsworth fuser since 1965.
Right.
So if we have an endowment of, say, a modest sum in these climbs of $100 million, that endowment would be able to spend $4 or $5 million that would regenerate every year.
Right.
And that's all it takes to investigate inertial electrostatic confinement. It doesn't take gigantic machines that cost tens of billions of dollars. I think you could probably build a Farnsworth fuser with sophisticated stainless steel techniques for about $500,000. Maybe more, maybe $1 million, but it's not tens of millions, it's not billions. And then you've got something you can experiment with. Then you invite people to make a suggestion. Let's try this. And if it passes muster with some governing board, we reconfigure and build that. But on a sustained, long-term, non-profit endowment approach. And I'm going to be having some meetings next month with some people to discuss the formation of what I'm calling the Water Star Foundation to
Right.
take that approach.
Well, that would be really cool if that was
Yeah.
solidified and brought into reality, and if it happens, and maybe one day
It's taken you an hour and 45 minutes, but you just got a scoop.
maybe we could combine Townsend Brown's the flying saucer device and have this power that maybe.
Well, okay, that is the conceit of my entire existence. What you just touched on right there, because in my fantastic imagination, I believe in what you just described, and that's why that I've been put on this case because these two things work together. Because remember, when we're talking about Townsend Brown's anti-gravity or electrogravitics, we're talking about the effect being produced at extremely high voltages.
Yeah.
It's an electrical effect produced by extremely high voltages. Now, if you have an effect that is capable of lifting some kind of vessel by virtue of artificially induced gravity, you need, and that artificial gravity comes from some electrical phenomenon, then you need some way of producing that electricity.
Right.
You can't do that with a tokamak. You can't put a tokamak on a flying saucer.
Yeah.
So when you look at these photographs of the fusers from the 1950s and 60s, you think, well, that might work. That would be like putting an engine in a car. It's a small component of the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in my summary of all this, I imagine here's the way I put it: if there are civilizations gallivanting around the galaxy, what they have at their disposal are the two technologies that I've touched on in my two books:
Right.
fusion energy and gravity control. And
Yeah.
the fusion energy is derived from an inertial electrostatic containment device that's not much bigger than an automobile engine, but produces the millions of volts needed to produce the electrogravitic effect.
Right. Right. And this, of course.
Now, if you'll excuse me for a moment, now I'm going to get my tinfoil hat.
Okay.
I should have worn it the whole time.
Yeah. And this is, of course,
Yeah.
besides the small number of people who are still thinking about zero-point energy to power such devices. I don't know how practical that is or where that is reached. But then,
Yeah,
if
I
you believe,
have no comment on 0-point energy or cold fusion.
right,
We're not.
Right.
I am not talking about cold fusion. I'm talking about hot fusion, the reaction that powers the stars, and being able to bottle that on Earth to derive useful industrial energy on Earth.
right. So that was definitely a fascinating story, and I think I want to stop the story of Philo Farnsworth right there. So this boy who grew up on a rural farm, self-taught, and a brilliant scientist, not really credited enough, who the world should probably know more about him, contributed in so many ways in television and a lot of other patents which we haven't really spoken about, but it's there in the internet and your book.
Yeah.
And then finally ending with the fuser, a potential solution for nuclear fusion. So that's really fascinating arc.
And if I may, to draw the connection between the arc between the photoelectric effect and E equals mc squared, we are making the statement that video came from the same well of cosmic knowledge that gave us nuclear energy and atomic bombs. And we are seeing that Farnsworth had the right idea about how to use the photoelectric effect to produce video, and he made it work. And he had an idea for how to bottle a star, and we cannot say with certainty whether or not he made that work.
That's a really cool story. Again, like I said at the end of the Townsend Brown podcast, this should be a movie, right? This could easily be a movie.
That's how I got into this. I was working in Hollywood at the time, and I wanted to make a movie about the boy who invented television. Here we are 50 years later, we still haven't done that, but I want $100 million to start a fusion foundation.
So before we close, what kind of effort does it take? How long have you been working on it? How long did you have to research? Like it must have taken a lot of work out of you to get to all these details and look at the science behind it, which is probably not your, like you said in the last podcast, not your core, like a degree or something.
Don't ask me what my core degree is, because I got a degree in communications from Antioch College in 1973. This has been the singular obsession of my life. I learned about Farnsworth in a magazine in 1973. I heard that story that I told you about the piece that was removed and put on the high shelf that same summer. I latched on to the idea of doing a movie for television about the boy who invented it in 1975, and that's when I met the family, and I have been on this crusade ever since. That's how long it takes.
So you're probably the only person on the planet right now who has so much information about him. There's probably nobody else who has more, except maybe his family, his wife, maybe, who's passed.
Yeah, and I think the generations that knew him, that knew him, that's his widow and his three sons. There's only one of them left, and he's in his I think he's 90 now. He was born in 1936.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so, but he's still living, but the other two sons died, and one in infancy back in the 30s. But the next generations, they had no first-hand knowledge. They have only the second-hand knowledge, starting with Philo III and Kent. But I knew enough, spent enough time with Philo III that has informed my approach and my attitude toward the whole thing. But it's for one reason, ask one of my ex-wives. Stayed on this for a bit on this.
Well, I hope your attempts to revive this and build this becomes a success, because I'll be keenly watching that and looking at what happens there. And I think it's very, very interesting work and a lot of hard work there. So on that note, maybe we have to wrap up. It's almost 2 hours. Paul, thank you so much once again for a very informative and entertaining podcast on
Thank you.
The boy who invented television.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks.